Okay, hi everybody. I think you can hear me because I can hear myself loudly. Good afternoon. My name is Tyler Taba. I'm the Senior Manager for Climate Policy at the Waterfront Alliance. I'm really excited to be here today and share an update and really a sneak peek on the New York City Council's effort to introduce legislation that would require the city to study what it would take to establish a dedicated voluntary buyout program, housing mobility, and land acquisition program. So I'll start the presentation by noting that my work is in the policy and advocacy arena. So I'm not an academic, I'm not a scientist, but I've learned so much from so many people at this conference. And so I know that we're going to need a whole host of expertise, obviously, on this really complicated and complex subject. So just a caveat, though, that this is from a policy and an advocacy lens. And then I'll also note that the legislation that's being, this legislative effort is being led by Councilmember Tiffany Caban's office, who represents New York City's 22nd Council District in Queens. Councilmember Caban was supposed to be here with me today for the presentation, but those who are following know that the City Council elections are happening right now, so it's a pretty busy time, but I'm excited to share some of our work together, and so I think with that, we can dive right in. Okay, so just quickly want to provide an overview of the Waterfront Alliance so folks can have a sense of our role in this space. So Waterfront Alliance, we are an alliance, of course. We've been around for 16 years, and our mission is that together with our alliance partners, we build, transform, revitalize, and protect accessible waterfronts for all communities. We do this through several avenues and program areas, including working with students and teachers across New York City to introduce climate change curriculum and field trips and field labs to local waterfronts, and that's known as our Estuary Explorers program. We also house the Waterfront Edge Design Guidelines, better known as WEDGE, which is a rating system for promoting resilience, ecology, and public access along the waterfront. And we're also highly active on ports and maritime, ferry transportation, expanding public access to the waterfront, and of course, my work, which is in policy and advocacy around climate resilience and adaptation. It's also kind of hard to look around because I feel like I have to talk really closely into the mic, but I'm doing my best. Okay, so, oops. A major part of our advocacy work that I just mentioned is through what's known as the Rise to Resilience Coalition. And this is a coalition of more than 100 organizations across New York and New Jersey, spanning from really large national and regional organizations down to some local frontline and smaller partners. And the represented in the coalition is not just environmental organizations, but residents, labor, environmental justice, housing, design, academia, and anything you can really think of. And the goal is really for us to collectively come together and urge that climate resilience be a more urgent policy priority and showcase all the different and diverse uses along the floodplain. So given the short time that I have for the presentation and the content that's already been shared over the past few days of the conference, I didn't want to get too much into the specifics of buyout programs, examples of buyout programs in New York City or in the state or across the country, but rather focus on some of the plans and visions for the future of buyouts in the city. And so when I was submitting this proposal for today's presentation, there were rumors that the mayor's office was exploring the idea of a voluntary buyout or housing mobility and land acquisition program. I know that the Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice was hosting some workshops that I believe were in coordination with the Nature Conservancy on housing mobility and land acquisition. And I know Waterfront Alliance, a lot of different organizations were part of those conversations. So we knew it was on the mind of the city, but we weren't really sure how it was going to shape out. And then late last year, Tiffany Caban's office reached out and expressed interest in proposing a bill that would require the city to conduct a feasibility study and assess really what it would take to develop a voluntary buyout program. And so I'll get to the bill in just a second, of course, but since that time, the city has launched their Plan YC report, which outlines a series of commitments and goals and actions on sustainability from everything from flooding to extreme heat, energy efficiency, circular economy, waste, and so on. And so on this slide, you'll see the city's kind of three core initiatives in Plan YC as they relate to flooding. So the first being creating a new leadership structure for coastal resilience to be housed under the Department of Environmental Protection. Second is implementing a multi-layered strategy for flood resilience. And then third is to launch a voluntary housing mobility and land acquisition program and to facilitate future land acquisition with federal and state funds. And so, of course, the focus of this presentation is on that third piece. And so the city has looked at or mentioned and referenced buyouts several times. Over the past few years in the comprehensive waterfront plan, housing mobility is defined as the ability of residents to find and secure a home that improves their housing or neighborhood conditions. And Plan YC builds on that definition and characterization, going on to add land acquisition into the mix, where the city aims to commit to actively pursuing and leveraging state and federal dollars to acquire properties in areas with high coastal and stormwater flood risk, where other options to reduce vulnerability are limited. And then they reference some existing funds to use that you'll see here, and I'll also get to that in a moment. So as I mentioned, we had been working with, I'm just going to shift into the bill now, but I wanted to talk about Plan YC just because that came sort of in the middle of this bill effort. And so just wanted to set the stage and the framework on the timing of all of this. But as I mentioned, we began working with Councilmember Caban's office before this announcement was formally made. And with the city's latest commitments that we just saw, I'm sure you're wondering if a legislative route is really necessary anymore. And I hope the case that I can make today is that we should codify any plans or commitments on this to become a law, so that it's something that transcends administrations and can become a permanent sort of structure in our climate resilience toolbox. And so the way that Councilmember Caban's office has approached this topic, and I should note that this did also come through feedback from not just Waterfront Alliance, but lots of our great partners and organizations in the region, like Environmental Defense Fund, Rebuild by Design, and others. But the goal is to require that the city conduct a feasibility study on voluntary flood zone buyouts and related support services. And that study to be housed under the New York City office, the Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice. Although Plan YC did reference that DEP would be the lead on all flood resilience efforts, so I expect there'll probably be some deliberation on who would lead on this, but regardless would consist of several different relevant agencies coming together. And that first bullet, is a few of the different acronyms for some of the city agencies. There's a lot of them. And this task force that is referenced is one that already exists. How active that group is, I'm not actually sure, but we do know that this undertaking would require a lot of interagency coordination, given the role and jurisdiction and expertise of all the different agencies. So, for example, zoning under DCP or city planning, transforming land into open space maybe falls under parks, roads repairs under transportation, sewer upgrades under DEP, mental health services under Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, and so on. So the second bullet here also expands on that, on the definition again of voluntary buyouts. And I think it includes something really important here, which is the underlined part on permanently converting those properties to use as public spaces for the purposes of flood protection. And this is obviously really a key part of any buyout program, because the worst case scenario is for a voluntary buyout to take place, and then that home or property be redeveloped for future residential use and putting somebody else at risk again, or turning into a parking lot or something like that. And I know that's been an issue with the Staten Island Oakwood Beach buyouts. So how do we ensure that that's not happening as buyouts do take place? So the feasibility study in this legislation would highlight these 5 core components for the city to evaluate and make recommendations on: housing adaptation report, voluntary buyout program framework, a buyout fund, strategic oversight, and then pilot study for support services. And so I'll just go into these and the thinking behind these and the specifics very quickly. So starting with the housing adaptation report, this would recommend strategies and measures that take into consideration existing plans like Plan YC or the Environmental Justice for All plan, or the New York City Panel on Climate Change's research, comprehensive waterfront plan, and all the sort of plans that the city has referenced or mentioned buyouts or flood risk. And for those who are not from New York City, these are only a few of the plans that various agencies and entities have put together that would be useful to compile information from. But the idea is for this portion not to recreate, but to gather some of the resources as an index or a repository of information that's already been detailed over the past few decades or years on climate risks or green infrastructure or environmental justice, zoning, development, and so on. And then the next component is that the task force would identify high priority flood hazard zones in which property owners and renters would likely be eligible to participate in a voluntary program and to receive support services. So that would be sort of the framework. And the program would include, but not be limited to, the following bullets here on the right-hand side of the slide. So that includes eligibility requirements, prioritization criteria, and evaluation criteria for households and properties with consideration of the flood and climate risk profiles, but also the economic status of residents and owners, population density, environmental justice, and then potential for flood protection in the surrounding areas. The estimated number of eligible households and properties and the estimated total valuation of those properties. This one I think is a really important one, which is the streamlining of applications and evaluating whether certain applications could be eligible for participation in an advanced commitment or in a pre-certification process, given sort of the timing constraints that we've seen with buyouts historically. And then a few others, including provisions of integrating support services into the program, recommendations for community-led processes, and then the conversion of those eligible properties to flood risk reduction and public access, habitat restoration, whatever it might be. And then the third step is maybe the most difficult one, which is proposing a fund to finance a voluntary buyout program and support services. So this would require some understanding and research into how to finance a voluntary buyout program and its support services, and that would include an analysis of the economic, fiscal, social impacts of a buyout program and the social services, so things like jobs, and local development, tax revenue, social and equity indicators, costs and benefits associated with different land uses, long-term costs of and benefits of protecting or rebuilding current residential uses, given the context of foreseeable future climate risk, and also the savings from potential flood mitigation uses of those acquired properties. And I put the Bond Act and FEMA's HMA grants. Like there's a few, I think, avenues to explore in terms of funding. I mean, the Bond Act does have some funding for a buyout program. I don't know if it's enough necessarily for a dedicated program, but just as a way to sort of maybe jumpstart. And then I should also note this last bullet here, which is a framework for establishing, structuring, managing, and administering a permanent buyout fund. And that kind of bleeds into this next and fourth category, which is the strategic oversight. And this is, I think, the one that is the most ambiguous and I have the least clarity on, but the idea here is that there would be recommendations for structure of the administration, coordination, and leadership of a permanent program. And that would also come with recommendations for any legal, regulatory, policy changes that the city may have to undertake to set up those structures. And I think zoning is a really key one that falls into that. And then the final component here is one that I think is really important, which is a pilot study on support services. And this one's really important, I think, given the nature of New York City, and we can really look at some of the existing buyout programs and the successes and challenges, and we absolutely should and will do that. But the material reality and conditions of New York is very unique. We're in a housing crisis, and there's a whole host of social and economic factors that I think are different in New York City than a lot of places in the country. And so I think some of the ways that you could get to assess some of that information is through a few of the examples listed here, which are baseline surveys that would assess household composition, so primary language, length, and nature of tenure, interest level of participation in this kind of program, but also focus groups where the city could conduct some qualitative interviews with focus groups to better understand the knowledge, needs, concerns, and goals of likely eligible households. And then finally, some recommendations for support services that would be required and available, specifically how those services could be integrated into a permanent program and to the extent to which they could be supported and should be offered. So that's just a very quick overview. And I think the next steps here, as I mentioned, is that the bill is really still in draft form, meaning there are a lot of changes that could still be made. There's no formal bill actually introduced yet. There's no number. There's no official co-sponsors yet, although we have talked to a few offices who I think are supportive of this. And for those who might not have worked in policy, I do have to say that this is definitely not the norm. Councilmember Caban's office has been very transparent throughout this whole process, letting us come to the conference and share a draft bill and language with everybody. And so we're excited, and I know her office is very open to making a lot of amendments to the bill. And so while it doesn't exist, I think this is an opportunity to ask questions and sort of help shape what the program might look like. And then when a bill is formally introduced, there will obviously be an opportunity to testify in support or make amendments to that language. And we have, I should also mention, connected Councilmember Caban's office with the Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice to sort of talk about the parallel tracks that are going here with the city's plans on a buyout program and the council's. And again, I hope that these two things can work together and that we can codify something so that this transcends administrations. And I know I'm out of time, but really quickly, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that we as Waterfront Alliance and the Rise to Resilience Coalition really recognize all of the really important policies, infrastructure, community visioning planning that's going to be needed for all of the work that's ahead of us. There's no silver bullet solution. And so on the right side, I put the coalition's 6 points of unity, which are sort of the backbone for all of our policy efforts. And, for those who don't know, on June 9th, the New York State Legislature finally did pass a flood disclosure law to fix our broken flood disclosure law, which allowed sellers to pay a $500 credit and avoid disclosing. And now we're on our way to having comprehensive disclosure for buyers and renters. And I'm excited to think about what's next with all of that. There's a lot more that I wanted to say, but I know I got the 2-minute warning like 5 minutes ago. So I will wrap up there. And thanks everybody for listening. I hope this was helpful, and I'll pass it off to the next speaker. Thank you.
Hello, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Alex Pennington. I'm the director of the Research and Strategic Analysis team at the New York State Office of Resilient Homes and Communities. A bit of a mouthful. We were formerly known as the Governor's Office of Storm Recovery. We're transitioning to a more permanent, more uplifting name. We're going to be sharing some of our research with you today. We presented some of this last time, and we actually have results now to share. So hopefully that's exciting and piques your interest. As you know, or as some of you may know, the Governor's Office of Storm Recovery implemented a buyout and acquisitions program. We're all here because we know about buyouts. I don't think I need to spend a lot of time on this slide, but we incentivize people to move out of an area, created natural coastal buffers, transformed their parcels of land, and tried to do a ground-up approach. We selected these communities based on their input. We did this with the cooperation of homeowners, which we've heard a lot about already at this conference, how important that is. It's real important to get buy-in for your buyouts. So we tried to do that. Our research is focused on where did our applicants go? We're a government agency. We do sit on a mountain of data that lots of people just don't get to see and don't have access to. There's a decent amount of literature on how to incentivize people to move, what gets people to move out of their home, how can you get people to go away from a place. But considering that these communities were engaged and wanted to go somewhere, we had the sort of follow-up question of, well, where did you plan to go? What did you want to do? So I mentioned this at the last conference, the last time this was had. I went through the data methodology, and I'm happy to answer questions on that or walk anyone through what we did, but it was a long process and it took a long time. And as a government agency, we don't have a lot of resources, but in our spare time, whilst we worked, when we had, little breaks in like our super intense government work, we chipped away at this stuff. But overall, out of a universe of over 1,000 applicants, around 60% of them were matched from their original location that we bought out to a location that they owned and moved to. The other 40%, we just don't know what happened. We're not going to discuss them. We don't know what happened. We can't figure that out or put them in a box. But we looked at the matched universe that we had. They are demographically very similar to the overall universe. So we do think it's a good sample size. We do think that gives us some external validity to look at the 60% group to figure out, okay, how might everyone have moved? And maybe how would other participants in New York go through this if we go through this again in the future? So we had some guiding questions. We wanted to know where our applicants went to. Were there any demographic patterns in the way that people moved? And was there a difference between our buyouts and acquisitions program? Because there are nuances between the two. With that, I'm going to let Peter Mattingly share those results with you. Thank you.
Hey, everyone. All right. So thanks, Alex. I'm Peter Mattingly, Research Program Manager, and get those cameras ready to go in. We're gonna hop in, and buckle up. Okay, so all right. So overall, we're ecstatic to see that those that we were able to identify through our research, that 91% of applicants relocated to areas much safer in terms of flood risk. And we can see in this flow chart or Sankey diagram that on the left-hand side, we have the flood risk of the original address for the applicant. And on the right-hand side, the flood risk of the new destination property. And we can see that overwhelmingly, the majority moved to an area with a reduced flood risk. And that they were able to move to an area reduced or equal in terms of flood risk, with one exception. My parents here moved to a floodway. But we did actually investigate, and it turns out, so the property itself in this case actually does not lie in a floodplain, but part of the land does, which we'll take. But overall, we were able to see, massive reduction in flood risk, which is great. And then when we take a look at the entire migration pattern, looking at the entire country, we can see overall where applicants relocated to as far west as California, as far north as Maine, and we typically did see a fair amount of migration to New Jersey, Florida, and the Carolinas. If you choose to relocate there, then maybe find a friend. And then, so while we did see applicants relocate out of state, we're of course interested in seeing where people relocated within state. And we're very happy to see that the vast majority actually did stay within New York State. So when considering whether the applicant was in the buyouts or the acquisition program, and whether the incentive affiliated with the buyouts program had an effect, we do see here that a large share of our applicants in the acquisition program relocating out of state compared with the share of the buyout applicants. So with the buyout applicants receiving an incentive, more likely to stay within not just the state, but also their own county as well. So very reassuring that we were able to hold on to a fair amount of New Yorkers. And we can see here further in depth migration patterns within Staten Island here. If you look very closely, you can see my first apartment in New York. It's not pretty. I don't live there anymore. So when we do take a look at a more granular level, in this case, the block group, we can see in the maps where applicants were originally located in that really gorgeous tangerine red that you can see primarily along Oakwood Beach on the far right side. And then also too in kind of a musky orange along the coast there that you can see also at the very south in Tottenville. There's the overlap. But what we see primarily the vast yellow representing where the majority of people moving inland. Very reassuring that more people were moving away from the coast. And if we were to say add a flood layer to it to be able to identify exactly the risk affiliated with it. And while it's not a perfect overlap because these are blocks representing, a large group of people and don't really pick up maybe on a granular level scale of the individual house, we can see that the vast majority moved out of that. You can see on the coast, the flood hazard layer moving inland with reduced flood risk. And we can also say the same for Suffolk County out on Long Island, where it's even more prominent too, where we can see the vast majority where they were located originally along the coast, and we see a migration pattern within, and some overlap here and there throughout the county. Adding that layer in too, we can see much more clearly that reduced flood risk as more people moved inland away from those hazardous areas. Anyone need me to go back? We all got the map. Show your friends what Staten Island looks like. All right. And so results, because we want to be more robust, methodological. So statistically speaking, we did come across some very interesting findings with the sample that we had. So while there were no significant findings tied to any demographic variable necessarily, whether it be age, or I'm sorry, race, ethnicity, LMI status, related to the flood risk, the location, the price, or the distance away moved in terms of the destination property, we did find that age was a significant variable here, that older applicants tended to pay on average less for their destination address. We also did see that compared with non-LMI, and all LMI stands for low to moderate income status, and compared to non-LMI applicants, LMI applicants spent less of their award on their new destination home, which does suggest that various expenses are tied to the relocation process holistically. And in the bigger picture, considering what it does cost to relocate, that some of those expenses were there. And then lastly, we did observe a positive relationship too, where applicants receiving an incentive to relocate did also reduce their flood risk. So what we think of as successes, what do make this program quite successful, is that, if you were to leave here with any main highlights, besides, the jarring image that is Staten Island, we want you to note that overwhelmingly, the majority of applicants reduce their flood risk. That applicants participating in the buyouts program receiving a relocation incentive were significantly more likely to relocate within their county while also reducing flood risk. And that migration outside New York State in this context followed typical migration patterns, with the exception of Florida and the Carolinas, which may be due to various reasons, such as retirement, family obligations, and so forth. And also too, that the size of the awards received were positively associated with the distance moved, so that the larger award received, the larger the distance moved from the origin address. And then we think about other takeaways as well, kind of going back to that significant finding that we had about older applicants tending to downsize, thinking about if they're retiring in some way, whatever stage they are in their life course, that might be sort of accelerated jump to retirement, this event here. And the only statistically significant demographic trend that we were able to identify was that Asian applicants did typically pay on average higher for their destination price. But due to sample size issues with this group, this may not be the most reliable figure that we can take away just yet. And of course, I think when we're thinking about future research, because I think I got time, right? I sped through this. Okay. So thinking about future research, where we'd like to take this research to the next stage, vulnerable populations do face really unparalleled risk in the context of recovery from extreme weather events. And we want to ensure that applicants who do qualify for that really are given all the necessary resources to be able to attain comparable housing and don't necessarily have to make those compromises. We also want to further explore this idea of comparable by evaluating the similarities and the differences between the origin and the destination address, so that we can understand things like location, affordability, and proximity a bit more, so that this idea of comparability actually exists. And then we also hope to identify, how potential population shifts have potentially impacted local tax bases, both short and long term in these areas. While we do see a fair amount of people staying within the same county, it's interesting to see what a dramatic shift might happen after such an event. And of course, it takes more than a lonely researcher with their computer at night doing this research, and wanting to thank the entire ORHC team for allowing us to do it and explore. So thank you.
Hi, everybody. Apologies if I spontaneously start shivering. I didn't dress for these wintry conditions in here. My name is Geronimo. I'm a PhD candidate at the Rutgers University at the Bloustein School of Planning and Public Policy. And the title of my talk today is Shaping the Landscape of Risk, Federal Transfers for Floodplain Interventions. And this is a picture I took on one of my field visits to Tom's River. And I just think it's kind of a funky looking picture, right? You see this mansion elevated up on stilts, and it looks kind of futuristic, a little bit bizarre. And this is a phenomenon I've been studying is, right, what are the types of federal incentives that keep us in place? So this is kind of the flip side of the coin to buyouts. Why do we stay in areas that have experienced repetitive losses, and how do federal funds kind of kick in and shape this landscape of risk? There we go. Okay. So my research interest lies at this intersection of planning and public administration, coastal flood risk and resilience, and land use in the context of climate change. And my motivating question is really how and why do communities keep rebuilding in coastal areas that experience repetitive flood losses? So there's different types of physical responses to flood risk, and these are categories by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, right? You can do nothing, you risk getting flooded. You can advance, you can build out, fill in land, and build out into the ocean. You can protect with storm surge barriers, seawalls. You can retreat, which is basically the whole topic of this entire conference. And one of those strategies is through property acquisitions, as we've been hearing from our colleagues. You can accommodate through elevations, and you can do ecosystem adaptation. I'm really interested in the dichotomy between property acquisitions and property elevations, because at the property level, these represent two distinct adaptation pathways of stay in place through elevation or leave. And so how are our federal funds being directed to these two strategies? So if we think about how these types of actions get funded, there's a spectrum of programs that operate within different timing of the National Disaster Recovery Framework. And this is a figure I borrowed from Emmerich and Tate down at the University of Central Florida, excuse me. And it describes this continuum, right? You have this ongoing cycle of preparedness, then a disaster hits, and you have all these programs that kick in the short, intermediate, and long term. So he's evaluated FEMA individual assistance programs, SBA, National Flood Insurance, and Community Development Block Grant funds. And I'm adding in public assistance and especially the hazard mitigation assistance program. So I'll be focusing on this during my talk. And when we think about how these funds are implemented, we want to incorporate both equity and efficiency, which have been sort of historically left out of how we consider implementation of these types of funds. From an equity perspective, we have to understand that these programs, this complex suite of programs, are interacting in a historic space that's been shaped by historic land use, housing, and financial policies that have discriminated against certain populations through redlining or discriminatory lending, resulting in landscapes of segregation. And so as we implement policies over those landscapes, we must take them into account in order to achieve equitable outcomes. From an efficiency perspective, we have to recognize we're operating in a changing climate. So what we invest now, the amount of money that we put into certain strategies, what is the best use of that money for the most services, right? So how can we use these funds the most efficiently? All right, so I approach these questions through a mixed methods approach. I have a national study of one of those programs, right? The FEMA Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, which is really known for funding a lot of buyouts, but I'm looking at some other property actions that it funds, specifically elevations. So I've done a quantitative analysis looking at empirical analysis of trends and spatial analysis of where these elevations and buyouts are actually happening. And this has led me to a salient case study of Ortley Beach in Ocean County, New Jersey, where I've done field work, observation, and interviews with 30 stakeholders, including residents and local, state, and federal officials. So I'll dive into the results. So looking at the national picture, if we look at the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, it's the largest of FEMA's hazard mitigation assistance programs. It's funded over 130,000 property actions. The most actions it's funded are with regards to wind retrofits and safe rooms, but it also has funded over 40,000 acquisitions, and it's funded over 7,000 elevations. So I've looked at a select number of property actions over time. We can see that there were a lot of buyouts or property acquisitions in the early 1990s when there were some large floods in Missouri and the Midwest. But this follows this spiky trend pattern in response to these presidential disaster declarations. And what I've noticed is a little bit of an uptick in the number of property elevations over time. So I'm curious about what's going on with that. So if we look at counts of hazard mitigation funded elevations for flood related events by county over the last 30 or so years. This is the picture at the national scale at the county level. So we can see a lot of these elevations are actually concentrated in coastal areas, which has led me to this interest in this salient case study of Ocean County, New Jersey, where there's been a lot of these federally funded elevations. So I've looked at federal cost share for FEMA funded elevations in the post-Sandy era, as well as buyouts, and comparing the two. Overall, we can see a lot less money has been spent on elevations, around $9 million, compared to buyouts, around $188 million. We can see, though, also that the elevations are concentrated along the coastal shoreline counties, these zip codes in the coastal area. And I'm going to be focusing a lot on my case study in Toms River right here. But you can see the buyouts have been focused inland. Now, there's been less money in elevations, but the land use consequence has been that there's actually more elevations, right? So less money, but the consequence is we're rebuilding out more in the coastal zone, whereas we see fewer buyouts. This is, again, caveat, this is one program. There's other programs that fund buyouts and elevations, but this is just the consequences of this one program I'm looking at. So zooming a little bit more to Toms River, this is the shape of the town. We can see these areas have experienced repetitive losses in these yellow dots, and in red dots is where there's been severe repetitive losses. So through conversations with the municipal planning staff, I was directed to focus a case study on Ortley Beach, which is an area that has experienced severe repetitive losses. It's a barrier island community that was completely overwhelmed during Superstorm Sandy. The storm surge actually ruptured the dune and washed over the island connecting to the Atlantic side and substantially damaged nearly all of the buildings, all of the homes. So it's a community that's largely white, higher than average income. And what happened, they completely rebuilt after the storm, right? There's an influx of federal funding that came back and everything was rebuilt right in the same place. It's a bit ironic because this actually is known as having been a former inlet that connected the Atlantic to the bay. So we're rebuilding, and these federal streams are helping this happen. So these are just some photographs that you can see where we see this overwash, this effect from Superstorm Sandy. Homes completely pushed up their foundation. What's happened 10 years later? Well, we've completely rebuilt. Homes are propped up on stilts. We're spending lots of money on dune replenishment, but there's this constant issue of dune erosion on the Atlantic side. And then on the bay side, you have chronic flooding because it's lower elevation. It's also dealing with a lot of development pressures. So you can see this home, for example, it's a new condo going up right next to what is a buyout, Blue Acres buyout site. So on one hand, you're buying properties out, and right next door, right behind a dune, you're building them up. And at the same time, you're dealing with this chronic erosion. So this has led me to, well, why are we doing this? What's the logic? What's the rationale? And that's why I got into the interviews. I wanted to ask people what they thought. So, what do people want? Where do they want to see federal money spent and why? So I've asked people at the federal level, state, local level, and among residents, and there's a lot of conflicting answers, right? There's a lot of conflicting rationales. So property owners might say something like, hey, don't build the dunes higher because I don't want to have my view blocked. That'll decrease my property value. So kind of this conflicting logic, right? So this is just a brief output from my interviews where I've intersected or seen what values co-occur when people discuss different types of coastal risk reduction strategies. And so, for example, with elevating homes or insurance or beach and dune replenishment, people are largely concerned, like the salient values that came about were economic impacts, right? People are wondering, how is this going to hit my pocketbook? What are the implications for my personal finances? What am I going to have to pay out of pocket? But also, what are the implications for municipal finances? What are implications for larger finances at the national level? There's also concerns about effectiveness. Is this really the right strategy to be investing in? Are property elevations really going to hold up? Are the dunes going to hold up as future flood risks come into play? What's fair in terms of processes and also the distribution of resources? And really, who's responsible for paying? And what should the cost share distribution look like? So the takeaway is that there's a lot of conflict in values around the best courses of action from a diverse variety of stakeholders. So there's different types of conflict, actually. So there's conflict within individuals. One man I talked to, his family had lived there his whole life, and he wanted to rebuild in the exact same place that his grandfather had laid down the first bricks, but he also was fearing for his life. He's really scared about when that next dune breach was going to happen and wipe his home off his foundation again. So conflicts within individuals. There's conflicts between individuals or groups of people about who should bear the cost, right? Should it be a federal responsibility, local responsibility, or a personal individual responsibility? There's conflict over time horizons and risk perception. So when do we actually take action? And there's conflicts generated by human responses, right? You saw that overdevelopment pressure in the coastal zone. So I think that there's strategies and points of leverage to achieve more efficient and equitable outcomes. One is to do more co-production, which is we've heard in some of the other sessions, right? We need to be doing some community-driven climate adaptation planning. And one of the strategies that I think can help do this is a strategy coming out of the Netherlands to use adaptive policy pathways approach, where you talk about how you're on a business as usual course of action, you have your current policies, but you might hit a trigger point or a tipping point where a policy no longer works, right? You may elevate all of your homes, but if the road network floods and you can no longer access your home, then that policy is no longer working. So you might have to switch to an alternative pathway. So I think a policy pathways approach and a socially negotiated understanding of when those tipping points are can help us. But in relation to that, I think we need to really take a careful look at cost share allocations. So who's paying for what? If we keep throwing money at incentivizing home elevations, you're going to see rebuilding in the coastal zone. It's just going to keep going up over and over again. So, if the homeowner pays less, then you're going to see more home elevations. So there's really an equity question around who should get this money, how should we distribute it, when do we want to start incentivizing different types of behavior, such as withdrawal. That concludes my formal presentation. I just want to thank my sponsors and my partners at the state, federal, and local level. I acknowledge the Sea Grant Consortium. I have 2 minutes left, so I'm going to quickly just touch on some emerging work at my lab under the direction of Dr. Clint Andrews. This is a figure generated by a master's degree student, Jung-Hoon Lee, that shows, the different federal funding flows to different entities post Superstorm Sandy. So we can see a lot of funding coming out of US HUD and the FEMA public assistance programs and the Federal Transport Administration going to the municipal level. And this is, I've kind of built on this methodology to try to dig into, so this is building out the public assistance program, where is this federal funding flowing? And what kind of actions is it funding? So we're seeing a lot of money for debris removal, for public utilities in the wake of Superstorm Sandy, and a lot of this is going to my case study community or in Ocean County, right? So what are these federal funds that are supporting rebuilding post Sandy, and that might be kind of creating a barrier to retreat? If we look at HUD, this is going towards households by project, and I'm looking at cumulative cost shares by county. And I want you to just kind of focus on this reconstruction, rehabilitation, elevation, and mitigation program. So this is, of course, helping households rebuild. And we're seeing, again, a lot of these HUD funds going to Ocean County, and a lot of them are going towards unmet needs. And so I want to just emphasize that if we put more money into rebuilding these places post-disaster, and we have all of these agencies that are funding these different activities and are supporting infrastructure to prop up property markets in the coastal zone, then we're going to see more property at risk and more communities at risk, right? If we want to flip the script, then we've got to put more money into, take this money and think about how it can be reallocated into a retreat program. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you so much.
Hi, everyone. My name's Josh Rotbert, and I'm here to introduce some research into adaptation and recovery support for affordable housing in New York. Before I begin, I'll just introduce the project team. Just a little background. Most of this research was done using with members of Cornell University's Adaptive Land Lab, with funding and research support from EDF and the Cornell Atkinson Center, as well as support from various other government, nonprofit, and community organizations. And so why are we doing this work? Basically, we started out by assessing the landscape of affordable housing and their adaptation needs. We looked at the risk and policy landscape, and we specifically looked at affordable housing to find the opportunities and gaps that exist. We identified existing adaptation and mitigation strategies, the ones that were successful and maybe not so successful. We also sought to inform future policy development for recovery and adaptation. And we wanted to see how we could help design adaptation solutions to support affordable housing specifically. Here's a quick overview of our project and the process. I kind of want to stress that it hasn't been a very linear one. We did some work on one area, and then it informed a different area, so we kind of jumped around. I think the first one I'll talk about is the mapping and analysis portion, where we used open source and publicly available data to help map housing affordability and risk in New York City. And then we sought to design and implement a survey of specifically co-op residents, which I'll get to in a minute, and where our questions were informed by community organizations as well as our understanding of the policy landscape. And then the last piece of it was really that we did an extensive review of existing policy and funding mechanisms for affordable housing and green infrastructure, which we thought was a good way to leverage alternative funding streams. And basically, our overall goal was to identify new policy opportunities. So to begin, we looked to open source data to help inform the mapping analysis. We used mostly New York City based data sets, which include things from New York City Planning and their open data site, but we also used a really valuable resource from the NYU Furman Center that had subsidized housing information that helped us really narrow down which properties we cared about. So what was affordable housing and where? That was sort of our next task. It was to decide which kinds of categories we cared about. So we identified 6 major categories of properties within the city, and we sought to include these in our analysis. You know, these include, of course, public housing, and we had some single room occupancy and homeless shelters included, but we also identified through the combination of those data sets that I just showed, which co-ops had tax exemptions, which were subsidized, or which were sort of HDFCs and ANCs that had some management assistance through the city. So we identified all of these properties, and then we sort of trimmed it down. We decided to focus specifically on co-ops for a number of reasons. And you can see our sample size went down by about a quarter. And why focus on co-ops? Well, in New York City, a more significant portion of our housing stock is co-ops than compared to the national average. If you look at the American Housing Community Survey from the US Census, New York City has about 6% of its total housing stock as co-ops, whereas the national average is like well below 1%. And co-ops are known to help preserve affordability, collective action, and resist displacement because you have a collective organizational structure. However, as we've discovered, they remain largely unsupported by existing policies and programs. And then the last reason we really wanted to focus on them was because a large body of research focuses on public or subsidized housing as opposed to cooperative housing. So our first task was to really map the risk. Here I identified floodplain layers to create a composite floodplain that illustrated risk. We used, different pluvial, fluvial data sets, as well as sea level rise and tidal inundation. And included in that is historic inundation from Sandy. And we identified, we took our sample size of co-ops, we mapped them, and then we identified which were at risk. And then we went on to, here's the breakdown of that risk. And then it basically shows that cooperative housing is a third of cooperative housing is at risk in New York City. And our next component was to design a survey. We wanted to hear from residents on what their experiences were with flooding and what kinds of policies and plans they had contact with. We designed a paper-based and a web-based survey, and which is ongoing. Right now, we're still collecting responses, but we targeted the co-op board leaders or management companies that run these buildings. And you can see that we've decided only to select about 1,200 because these were the most affected properties. And in our survey design, we really guiding our questions back to our overall project structure. We didn't really know what the best questions to ask were. We consulted with community organizations and community land trust focused organizations to kind of tell us what the best questions to ask were, but we also looked to our policy assessment to help inform which questions were most important. So I think the last big component of this was that we assessed what existed for co-ops and what kind of support was out there. We discovered that the primary mechanism for disaster recovery, which is the Stafford Act, really largely leaves co-ops largely unsupported. This is the same in the National Flood Insurance Program, which provides specialized insurance to condos, but not to co-ops. So what we really did was we identified that the first two bullets here are primarily directed at disaster recovery, but we also then looked at how co-ops can better prepare for flooding through leveraging green infrastructure and flood resilience programs. And while there are policies for green infrastructure and co-ops, we sort of laid out where they overlap to see where we could leverage these gains. And what we can see here is that we laid out, this slide shows kind of a sample of the major policies we reviewed and how they're categorized and whether they provide funding for green infrastructure or whether they provide funding for co-ops. And you can kind of see that the left side are adaptation based or geared toward adaptation, while the right side are more relief focused. And we unfortunately only identified that there were two programs that could leverage green infrastructure and support co-op housing. And then even the ones that are co-op housing eligible were very limited in their support. Like, for example, the FEMA Individual Assistance Program can only be done through a state agency. So, and that too, they have a limit of only 4 units. So this leads us to the last portion of our research, which was really that we wanted to identify where the policy opportunities were. And I think the largest and most obvious, but perhaps the most difficult, is to reform existing policies, right? If we can change the language in the Stafford Act to include co-ops, then we have solved a big problem, right? But whether or not that's feasible is another question. The other one was to expand buyout programs and support for co-ops with explicit support mechanisms for co-ops, and that we would also include that in green infrastructure and coastal restoration after buyout programs. So not just in the adaptation phase but also in the kind of post-disaster phase. The last was to leverage alternative funding streams. So like if we could tap into decarbonization and green infrastructure to support co-ops, then we should. And where they overlap would be really interesting to kind of push on. And then the last was to sort of integrate co-ops and green infrastructure into new programs that are coming out. So one example is the Bureau of Flood Resilience from the New York City DEP, which has the potential to include co-ops in its sort of mandate. And yeah, I mean, one thing about this last slide is that we will really take our survey results and try and incorporate them back into what kinds of policy proposals and ideas we have. We wanted to really hear from the residents on their experiences as well as what they've had contact with in the policy world. And we're excited to see those results and really map out how co-ops can be better supported by program current, future, and programs. And that's it.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much. I agree, this is freezing. My main expertise is studying the melting of Greenland and Antarctica, contributions to sea level rise for the past 20 years. So I feel at home here. But thank you so much for having me, to the organizers. I also, the reason why I'm here is not to talk about Greenland, but about 5 years ago, I started to work a little bit more on climate justice and social studies because I felt inspired by that. That's the real answer. As an old middle-aged man, I felt compelled to contribute from my position expertise, no authority, to help. And so I'm trying to develop more tools, and I focus my data experience on, and I'm working with people like Sheila Foster, Paul Galley, who's sitting also in the audience, on climate justice. And the work you're going to see is part of the effort that we established with the New York City Panel on Climate Change, the Equity Working Group, of which I'm a member now. And we looked at the combination of displacement, climate hazards, and social vulnerability. And we looked at multiple hazards. This is really a preliminary one. I mean, I have some results. We can talk about it, but there are so many caveats you can find in that. But I wanted to start a conversation because I think great presentation, a great description of the colors. I think it was more mustard than tangerine, but I think the question I was asking, for example, how do we know that some of the people in the relocated in the flood area, they are not exposed to other hazards, compounding effects? And I think this is something that we can think in the next 10 years. The NPCC will probably focus more on this. So I wanted to be also a little bit provocative in a humble way. So let me, I'm going to skip because I already wasted a lot of my time. But basically, you already know all this. I mentioned in words what it's basically there. What you see in the middle is CDSV is the Climate Displacement and Social Vulnerability Index that we developed. We submitted a paper to ERL, Environmental Research Letters. It's under review for about 3 months. And I'm happy to share a copy with all of you for the technical aspects. I know there's a lot of nuances in this work. So the more we share information, the better it is for everybody. Bottom line, what we do, we combine basically the FEMA Natural Risk Index, and I selected 5 categories. Basically for New York City, in this case, coastal, riverine flooding, heat waves, winter weather, and hurricanes. So winter weather is basically rain, snow, cold temperatures, and so on. And these are some of the maps. You can look at them online. There is all time. That's why I have them here. And we combine then the displacement index that the New York City office developed recently with the social vulnerability index. Now you can say we like the SVI, the SOVI, which ones you used, how many indicators, there's a collinearity, all this work has been going in, but there's still a lot of debate that we can have, and I think it's going to be very constructive. But so what happened here is that basically you take the 3 aspects, and again, I like to emphasize the idea that we look at multiple hazards. Now, this is not taking into account the combination of them, but at least it gives you an idea of mapping where multiple hazards might compound together with displacement and together with social vulnerability in specific areas. This is not how climate drives displacement or displacement drives climate. This is our next step, but this is really to understand, if we know how with these maps, and if we combine them, what are the areas that, given one event or multiple events, and if we take displacement as well into account, there might be at higher risk, and how do we basically make some intervention policies for that? So you have the CTSV, then you have the map. We looked at geographic analysis. I'll show you some results, but also what I did, I combined some of our maps with some of the work from the EJ screening tool, and I looked at some compounding effect combination between some health effects and some of the maps that we derived to have a better idea of how this can spill into health effects, which I think is one of the greatest questions that we might address in the future. These are the maps. From, in this case, it's coastal flooding, then you have riverine flooding, winter weather, heat waves, and a hurricane. I know this is not telling you a lot, but again, you have them on the presentation. The data is totally available. I have a link on GIS that you can grab it and use it. I'm more than happy to of course, interact and speak with you. I would love to speak with you to see if we can look at the maps you have of over displacement with some of the hazards that we have here. You also have overlaid here the Puma tracks, because these are some of the geographic units that are used in some of the data used, so that in case you want to know which Puma tracks is, you can look at it. What we did also, and there's a lot you can do, of course. You can play with this data in many ways. So staying focused is really hard, and also being effectively strong. In this case, for example, in the case of heat waves, what you can do, for example, you can separate percentage-wise what is the relative role of each of the three factors on the maps. For example, it tells you, is heat waves more the component or the relative role of heat waves on the index more important than displacement in some areas or not, according to the index. There are several ways you can also look this into future, and one of the aspects we're looking is machine learning to do attribution analysis. You can do the same with coastal flooding, for example, and of course you can see differences between the two. And again, it depends what you're looking for. You're looking for a single hazard, you're looking to understand what the role is, or have a better idea, or even just simply make a map that you can bring to your to the constituents or to your community and say, look, this is what's happening. We can make a map concerning this that we can bring, and we can educate and empower our community to raise our voices. We looked also, I was mentioning, at the compounding effects. So I looked at the tracts where, for example, you have, and again, sorry, I didn't mention this, the index is developed at census tract level. So we looked at the census tracts where you have the top 10 indices values are for each hazard. And so identify which tracts, these top 10s, they have they have multiple, basically, top 10. And we found some of the tracks, there are 4, some are 3, which is pretty high. And so I wanted to show you, in the paper, we have a long appendix with different areas. But here, for example, if you look at, in the case where we had 4 overlapping, this is basically in the South Bronx, in the upper, you have these multiple indicators. But in a nutshell, you see that, in the case of the Bronx area, you have a strong, and what basically the idea here is to see how demographic and socioeconomic has changed in the areas where the risk is higher, basically so that we can understand better how things evolve socially and understand what has been more exposed or less exposed and so on from a population point of view. In this case, for Bronx, of course, there's been an increase more in Latinx and Hispanics, African American, then the total population has been increasing, but at the same time, the percentage of white people has been relatively low and decreasing. This is not significant. If you move to Brooklyn, south portion of Brooklyn, here in this case, you have a large increase of Asians in this area, and also a very strong decrease in the percentage of white people starting in 2000, so almost a half, and a slow increase in the population. So just to give you an idea of how different areas, social demographic landscapes are being or can be identified, and what is the evolution in this case. One last thing that I wanted to, I'm just checking my time. I'm going too slow, so too fast, so I'll slow down. One thing that we looked at is the combination of the index with the health parameters. I looked specifically at asthma and diabetes and with heat waves. I think for the other hazards, it's kind of hard to find correlation or at least some connections between, let's say, flood and other events, because they're so rare. Even if you think about, water ponding or health issues related to water, it's still small. But what I did here, basically, I grouped the CDSV values by tens, and then you have the same for and then I look at the census tract diagnosed asthma adults between 18 and 65 of age. And I plot the box plots. What you see in the middle is basically the median value. The box plots are the top and the bottom, and the outliers are basically the percentile are on the dash. What you see here is in the case of the yeah, I knew that it doesn't show up. In the case of the asthma and heat waves, we see that there is a statistical significant relationship between the index and the people with asthma, which means that as your risk of being, or as your index tells you that the risk of being exposed to multiple hazards is increasing, the people exposed or the people with asthma is increasing. The number of people is increasing. So what does it mean? It might mean that if we keep looking at compounding effects, then maybe together with displacement, together with the social vulnerability, and of course climate, if we continue not to do anything in these areas, for sure there will be a lot of health compounding effects that will add to the population, mostly because, again, the highest number of people with asthma is living in places where you have the highest values of the compounded index. And this is very similar to, you don't see as strongly here because there is this little guy here outlier, which I wanted to keep, which scale up everything. But in this case, you have the R squared. There's still also statistical significance here in the case with diabetes. These are all things that we know from a qualitative point of view. These are all things that we suspect the relationship between, of course, health, racial segregation, social vulnerability, displacement, and exposure to vulnerabilities factors, climate hazards, and so on. But I think it's very important, at least this is what I like to contribute with, to quantify and put some numbers on these statements, mostly because this is what we're asked to do to bypass some obstacles to move to the next stage of the conversation. I think the conversation here is extremely interesting, mostly because the more I listen to all the young people who are working here, and I'm the oldest guy speaking today, the more is, to me, is important to talk about data climate justice, making an effort in trying to consolidate and move forward the field of how we interpret, how we use, how we expose the data. That is really important because data democracy is extremely important for understanding and properly quantifying the impacts of everything on climate, on socially vulnerable populations. So we, because I had the time, I can talk a little bit longer. We have also a Columbia internal grant that we are trying to put together. Paul Galley, Paul, can you raise your hand just for a second? He's one of the co-PI, and we're trying to put together people at Columbia to understand what is really climate justice at Columbia and what can we do. And I am really a big fan of the data climate justice component. Paul is looking at other aspects, and Jackie Klopp also, she's a co-PI and lead PI on this. The future work is explore other hazards to include this, of course, move to other cities wherever it can be moved, extended. I'm very much interested in understanding the dynamic relationships between displacement and climate. What is driving one and the other? And machine learning work that I'm doing with some of the colleagues in Greenland and another work can be literally translated to this for attribution analysis. And again, the feedbacks. What are the dynamic feedbacks of the systems that are interacting so that we can understand that if we plan something that had to happen in 30 years, but it's not linear, then we can still make it better because we understand better the process. And to conclude, tomorrow we have a session at a round table at 1:30 with Sheila Foster from Georgetown, thanks. And soon to be Columbia, she's moving here, hopefully. And Amy from the Rebuilt by the Sun. Sorry, I landed 14 hours ago. Sorry, I'm completely jet lagged. So we are going to have we hope to have as many people as possible because we are really interested in understanding the input from this community about the relationships between climate and displacement and what is that can be done with the data or what we could provide now, and how do we move to the next stage of understanding the dynamics and what should be the task for the MPCC 5. MPCC 4 is coming out in this year, and then what is the goal for the strategic goal for the next one. This concludes my presentation. Thank you for having me. And
well, we've got about 10 minutes for questions. So if you'd like to ask a question, you can just go to the mics that are in the center aisles. And maybe the panelists can come up and sit up here.
I'm with you.
Yeah.
What? I don't know. Tell me what to do.
You want to switch, Marco?
Yes. Yes. See, I have an next
You
slide.
go chair.
I have an
That's
next
good.
slide.
Having
I'm
everyone
ready
else
to
move.
shut up.
We're ready.
We did it. Time's over now.
Hello, my name is Sarah Lopuma. I work for FEMA Region 2, and I have a question for the researcher from Rutgers University. So in the case of Ortley Beach and Toms River, I was there as a plain citizen for Hurricane Sandy, and there was a real groundswell of restore the shore and a general sentiment of bringing everything back to the way it used to be. And so now that I'm at FEMA, I know that our mitigation funds are agnostic to what the state and locality and the homeowner wants to do, as long as you're doing an elevation or a buyout or other mitigation work. It's not as it is not the case that FEMA is pushing elevations. In the case of Toms River, that's what those homeowners wanted with their mitigation funds. So why would and also we know that there's mostly elevations and the shore and mostly buyouts in the riverine communities and inland. Why would an Ortley Beach homeowner that again might be anti-dunes because they want to see the sea, why would they have chosen a buyout at all? Like that's just like a difficult cultural question, because it is, it's a place for both historical value and tourism and love of being by the sea. So why would they have chosen a buyout instead?
Thank you for the question. Yeah, I appreciate it. Yeah, I think it's a really complex dynamic. What I'm trying to problematize or bring to the fore, I guess, is that the way that federal funding streams are set up makes it easy to rebuild, right? That's like an easy option, and it's going to be the go-to option. All of the homeowners obviously have a strong attachment to place. They want to build right back where they were before. So we're set up to do that. And the question is that though the fair way to use funds from a broader societal perspective? Like, is it fair for taxpayers inland or out in California or in Missouri, for their federal taxpayer dollars to be directed towards rebuilding in an area where we're pretty sure that there's going to be repetitive losses over and over again. So how can we maybe structure incentives to take into account that larger equity aspect? I also, like, in my conversations with homeowners there, it was really interesting actually, because some of the homeowners, we had a roundtable, and they were saying we actually didn't want to see people, like the whole block that was wiped out right behind the dune. The preference from the community was maybe it really wasn't actually the best thing to rebuild all of those homes, because it limits the amount of shoreline available to build out like dunes that are actually healthier in terms of being more like a wider dune system, a more expansive dune system. So there was some debate on, okay, if this happens again, should we really have a proactive plan to think about, okay, this has happened now several times. Should we go ahead and rebuild these properties again, or should we have a plan in place to think about an alternative pathway? So I think that there's like a little bit more nuance actually at the community level. Obviously the people who, and this is the conflicts I'm addressing, right? There's people who live in these homes, want to see them rebuilt, but then there's also the issue of when they're rebuilt, some people couldn't actually rebuild, they couldn't afford it. So what we had was a lot of investors came in, swept up those properties, bought them out at a sale price, and then built back these large secondary homes. So now it's become largely a secondary homeowner community. And so the question is, right, are federal funding flows fairly being distributed if we're seeing reinvestment in areas that are actually just kind of what some people fear is becoming a gentrified place that's really accessible only to wealthier communities who can come in on a seasonal basis? So I think there's a lot of like equity and efficiency questions that are ongoing and just worthy of more public debate. Thank you for the question.
So I'm going to kind of pick up on that theme of federal funding and how it incentivizes rebuilding in bad places. I'm from California and have spent a lot of time.
Well, you have the spotlight.
Yeah, I know, I see. I mean, the whole premise of this, misspending federal funds is through the National Flood Insurance Program, and it has to be completely overhauled. So those of us that are advocates have been advocating for this so that when I'm in California, I'm not paying for a second homeowner who's only there for 3 months to elevate their home. The travesty of building a brand new home next to a buyout home is just mind-boggling to me. And so that's why NFIP has to be completely overhauled. So this is a broad question to all of you, because I don't want to focus too much on you and your federal funds. We're definitely going to talk after this conference.
Sure.
So because of the bipartisan infrastructure law and Inflation Reduction Act, we've been crunching the numbers to look at incentivizing relocation. And it seems that primarily a lot of the funds are for transportation infrastructure. And we're actually literally helping build a toolkit so that states and municipalities can look at the coastal resiliency funds that are there. So I'm curious, in your research, like what has come up that you've seen for these two pieces of legislation that are relatively new, and CEQ and other agencies are starting to push them out. So how do you see these new pieces of legislation and its funding being used specifically for relocation of homes and transit infrastructure?
I'll respond to that real quick. So I haven't focused specifically on the infrastructure bill, but it has come up in my conversations. Actually, one of the interesting interviews I had just a month ago with one of the public administrators for Seaside Heights was there's a ton of money coming down the federal pipeline through the infrastructure bill. He said, it's a race to the money and we're in the race, right? Everybody's looking for the money. If you have a project, if you can find the money, we'll fund it. So what are they doing? They're looking for projects left and right to, they're going to issue an $8.5 million municipal bond. And they're going to spend the money on stormwater infrastructure, on, pipelines under the roads, on managing flood risk. But again, it's only a matter of time though, where he's like, oh, we're dealing with seepage and we have all this water seeping up through and it's affecting our lots. But we have faith that the federal government is going to implement the U.S. Army Corps of Engineer plan, and they're going to build that storm surge barrier, and it's going to keep the water out. But, you know, the water is going to seep under the island. And so there's a lot of, I think, kind of confusion. There's a lot of money. There's sort of like this reaction to let's grab the money, let's make the most of the money. But what are the long-term consequences? What kind of costs are being pushed off on the future generations? I think this is an intergenerational equity problem. And we're really focused on infrastructure responses, rebuilding in place, but I don't think there's enough going into really thinking about relocation and money, like money directed and earmarked for planning and building affordable housing or building housing outside of the floodplain. So I think a lot more could be done to actually earmark infrastructure bill money for rebuilding in areas that are safer. So my 2 cents on that.
Cool. I think if I can add to that, you know, there's a huge pot of money. People are going to race for it. And I think something that's been brought up in several sessions is there are communities that, you know, the communities that are poised to grab for that pot of money are probably not the most neediest. There are communities out there that just aren't prepared to access that money. They don't know how to access that money. And I think something that we want to do as the state and something that, you know, we want to do with our data, make it accessible, is like, how can we get communities ready to at least know what they can do? There was a good session this morning on, you know, all of the communities. How do we bring in environmental justice and give communities the tools to access these funds, to access the funds from the Bond Act, to access any other, you know, plethora of several different funds that they can and maybe need to access several different to get one successful buyout programs. It's complicated. And the session this morning focused on communities and focused on homeowners didn't think they had agency for like their own house. They just thought, oh, well, this is maybe the government's job. And if people aren't even thinking about their own flooding and their repeatedly flooding basements, like how could we even expect them to think about their infrastructure and their roads outside of their house? There's a lot of work we need to do, even if we've got the money, to make sure that that goes to the places that need it most. I'm sure plenty of places need money to do this, but it's a limited resource and we got to make sure it needs to go where it's most needed.
I might just add on to that a quick comment. Seaside Heights is an interesting case because there's a large Hispanic immigrant population, which makes it look from a census perspective like a socially vulnerable community. So it's eligible for a lot of these funds. But then if you look at the power structure, it's composed mostly of white wealthy homeowners, and those are the people who are making the planning decisions. So when you actually funnel the funds there, it's like, oh, we're funneling it to a community that is in need, but then the implementers or the people in the power structure at the local scale are using it to protect their properties and not necessarily to invest in helping out these most needy communities. So it's really complicated when you get down to this small local scale.
Yeah, one of the things that we looked at was the rental versus ownership, and it's very complicated. Of course, as you know, for privacy issues, but that's we found that the rent, especially in Miami, also the places where the homeowners are renting a lot are the most vulnerable, and so of course the owners are the one who making the profit, but the renters are the one paying the highest outcome in negative way. Yeah.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I think also in terms of cooperative housing, there's a tendency to think that a lot of co-ops are wealthier co-ops, right? They have big buildings, they have a lot of residents, but a lot of co-ops are actually, housing development fund corporations or area neighborhood cooperatives that are targeted and run by like low income and local residents. So like the fact that they are also not captured in policy and funding is also an important consideration if we're thinking about who's getting left out, right? It's sometimes the people you wouldn't expect, and they may be hidden in different kinds of housing arrangements. So yeah, it's a big question, and we just have to keep looking at what else we can do.
Mm-hmm.
All right, well, thank you so much to our panelists.